CESI has been organizing a series of monthly webinars on social innovation, perspectives and pathways to commemorate IIM Kozhikode's Silver Jubilee. The series aimed at providing a rounded understanding of the social innovation landscape in India and has drawn in actors from different sectors who are deeply involved in social innovation. Last year, CESI also offered a certificate program in social initiatives, and it was while putting together this course that we realized the need for understanding deeply the research methods to study social innovation. In the light of these unprecedented uncertainties that we face today on account of the global pandemic and climate change, the relevance of social innovation and entrepreneurship has increased manifold. In this context, today's panel aims to help academicians and PhD scholars who are curious about social innovation to be better aware of the research and teaching opportunities in this area. May I welcome our eminent panelists to this discussion, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming here. We do hope that the entire cohort of attendees to this conference will benefit enormously from your insights, especially young researchers and doctoral scholars. I now hand over the floor to Professor Simi to introduce our very eminent panel and get started with the discussion. Simi, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Priya. I don't want to take too much of the time talking about the panel. I would rather let them talk the idea. So what we have tried to do in this panel is to bring together people who have been working in this space, but who can bring different perspectives together so that we can see the phenomenon from the different sides, explore what the possibilities of research and teaching are there in for management scholars to pursue from different disciplinary angles, and also different methodological and analytical perspectives. So first, I invest Majumdar. He's been with a number of years. Has been
voice is cracking, Professor Simi.
Simi, your voice is cracking.
Would you like to take over?
So we would like to start this conversation with Professor Satyajit Marunda, the Dean, School of Management and Labor Studies from TIS, Mumbai. Professor Marunda, we'll be very keen to hear from you on what are the approaches of research in social innovation.
Thanks for the invite, and I thank Professor Mitra for initiating to bring me here to the conference floor. And really feeling great to meet several colleagues from different institutes and talking about the research domain of social entrepreneurship and social innovation. So probably I will set the tone of the discussion by saying what has been happening in the research and how the research has been happening based on my experience, though I can't say that I have very long experience, but I have some experience, and also try to sort of submit how we could proceed further. So I think I'll make 2-3 major submissions. First is the discipline of social entrepreneurship in research area, so far as the scholarly research area, is comparatively new. It's a new discipline in academics and research. Maybe we have a history of say 20-25 years, not more than that. So what happens when we pursue research in a new discipline? So the discipline is yet to be established. There are not many theoretical views to the extent that sometimes we doubt whether social entrepreneurship is an independent scholarly discipline or not. So we are yet not settled that. I think that's my first statement, whether social entrepreneurship is an independent discipline or it's a discipline which is added to the discipline of entrepreneurship research. So this is more a scholarly question. This is more a research question probably. Then the discipline itself is having multiple views, multiple theoretical views, and it's a highly contextual. That's the reason we have a lot of difficulty in defining what is social entrepreneurship. So in order to address that, 2011-12, when I was working with one of my PhD scholars, Nia Choi, we were struggling hard. How do we define a working definition of social entrepreneurship? So we were actually trying to work out on something, try to address, do we need to define it, and so on and so forth. Then around that time, we wrote a paper with a title that social entrepreneurship is essentially contested concept, ECC, and it's a cluster concept, which was published in 2013 in Journal of Business Venturing, and where we argued that it's not a one concept, it's not one definition, it's a cluster concept. And the scholar have to build up the space by making a mix and match of different subclusters, namely social value creation, social entrepreneurial organization, market orientation, or social innovation. So that was our first major writing on social entrepreneurship. And we felt that we could hit something by making this statement. And the paper also got reasonably good attention among the academic scholars. So it's very natural that new discipline will have this kind of difficulties, if I put it in a more scholarly term. Then around 2019, 2020, I was trying to see, do we have some bibliometric data, how the research is going on since last 15, 20 years, and who are publishing. So interestingly, I referred to some bibliometric studies and noticed that the data says that mostly management discipline scholars are publishing in the area of social entrepreneurship. And most of the citations were happening in entrepreneurship discipline journals. Of course, entrepreneurship discipline scholars were also writing, but interestingly, major writing was coming from management discipline and major citations were coming in the entrepreneurship discipline. And of course, interestingly, political science and economic discipline were also getting excited about this area. Then the next question which I posed to myself, what have they been researching on? What is that they are asking? What is that they are searching? So there were probably four types of researches going on. One is defining in the form of phenomenon. What is the typology? What is the taxonomy? Is there any distinction between business entrepreneur and social entrepreneur? Are they similar? Are they not similar? What are the predictors, etc.? That was the first group of research. The second group of research was explaining social entrepreneurship in different organizations, different motives, different method, social innovation, etc., etc. And unique entrepreneurial method. Is there anything unique about social entrepreneur? Do they identify opportunity differently? Do they gather resources differently? Do they form a fundamental profit social entrepreneurship process by which they focus only on social impact, or they focus on anything else? So unique method, entrepreneurial method, was the third pocket of the research which I noticed. And the fourth one is obviously the structure, which you always face a debate that whether it is non-profit, whether it is not-for-profit, community-based organization, Section 8, or private limited company, etc., etc. Interestingly, almost everywhere, the context specificity was very strongly argued on. And the different context, in different contexts, the scholars are searching on social value creation, role of the technology. These days, a lot of research is going on in the technology as an enabler, technology as a facilitator in creating a larger social impact, and also how economic and social value creation is balanced out. There is a lot of writing going on external view. That's how opportunity creation is happening, how opportunity discovery is happening. Some literature recently, in the recent past, maybe in a couple of years, I'm finding some research scholars, including my PhD scholars, are working on some internal process view, the HR processes, the risk-taking processes, risk perception, etc., etc., and also trying to see whether there's any diffusion happening in social innovation. And of course, the line between social innovation and technology innovation is always kind of not very clear. Then what we are saying is how the things are happening ahead. So I will end my statement by submitting that any new discipline, it has to start with qualitative research more case study based, grounded theory methodology, more descriptive, etc., and gradually we'll move from limited data study to big data study. I think that's the approach we are following. This is no different from any new discipline, because I was comparing with the discipline of strategic management and entrepreneurship. Largely, these two disciplines also followed the same, I would say, route for researching. And also, I think the time has come where we'll have to work more on the improving the validity, reliability, comparing and contrasting. Are there any noise factors? Are there any robust model? There are a lot of research opportunity exists in defining the business model. Are they fundamentally different? Recently, I tried two research pieces with my PhD scholar. We tried to use institution theory and try to see whether there is anything which we can bring in terms of looking at the value chain and using the institution theory. Can we theorize social entrepreneurship slightly differently? We published one in agriculture sector in India. Another piece we tried in social entrepreneurship as a context. We looked at it nation as a context and tried to see, do we have a narrative built up on entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship among Central Asian countries, especially the countries which have some kind of alignment in culture and an ecosystem so far as social entrepreneurship is concerned. So I feel happy to submit these statements and look forward to more conversation with the colleagues here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Majumdar, that you've really laid down so many areas of research we can further look into. And some of these areas, Professor Sumit, Professor Simi and myself are also trying to explore, particularly in terms of developing more case studies on social innovations in India. And we found that quite useful in the context of offering certificate programs and other programs for entrepreneurs as well. And we're in the process of creating these kind of cases. So thank you so much for your insights, and we'll definitely come back to you on more ideas and your guidance on how to develop this further. Next, let me invite, it's really a privilege to invite Professor Israr Qureshi. He's a professor of social entrepreneurship and at the Research School of Management in Australian National University. Professor Isra, we definitely are looking forward to listening to you on social innovators and digital development, the insights that you have gathered, as well as some of the research directions in that field.
Thank you, Priya. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so if anytime I'm not audible, let me know. I can stand closer to microphone because I cannot raise my voice.
Yes.
So it's a privilege to share a panel with Satyajit and Ankul, both very beloved colleagues. I think I'm very excited. And although my current situation is not good enough for me to take very active part, but I thought I don't want to miss this opportunity to be with them on the same panel. Thank you so much, Sumit, Priya, and Simi for invitation. Before I start, two shameless plugs on the chat box. The first one is a call from Management Organization Review on social entrepreneurship in China and emerging economy. And second one is Information System Journal's call for digitally enabled sharing economy models at the base of the pyramid. Both deals with the social entrepreneurship in some way or other. So any of you are interested, you can submit papers here. For the second one, deadline for abstract is 31st January 2021, and actual paper is due in September 2022, and September next year is full paper due. So I think if any of you are interested, you can look into those. On to the topic itself, on digital social entrepreneurship. There's always, I think Satya also mentioned this, there's an issue of scalability in social enterprise. And as we know very well, the context here is mostly people who are spread out. They are remotely located many times. So there's a suggestion that technology might help reach to people who are otherwise unreachable. And that's the optimistic way of saying it. We also know that the very same people don't normally have access to infrastructure which can help them connect. So then there's a kind of dilemma here. Okay, I'll provide that. While there's a dilemma here, that on one hand, technology has potential to reach to people who are quite spread out. On the other hand, those very people may not be technology savvy, may not be comfortable with technology, may not have access to technology. So in digital social innovation, this has always been a kind of trade-off, how much technology and what technology to use. And over time, there has been some convergence in the view is that you need to use technology only to the level where it's required, not something which you think is cutting edge. So for example, if something can be done over SMS, you don't require a platform-based initiative to address that issue. So we coin a term here, which we say technophysene. So using from satisficing notion of Herbert Simon, we propose a term called technophysene, which means you should use technology only to the extent you must, rather than using cutting edge solution for every kind of problem. So that means an approach where social first is important. So you identify social issues, you identify social problem, and then maybe one block of that problem can be solved using technology, or maybe not. If you don't require, you don't have to put technology into play. But if you identify certain aspect of social problem which can be leveraged using technology, then perhaps those kind of technologies are useful. And when you decide which technology to use, you should use most simple technology as possible. So if something can be done in simple tools, you don't need to incorporate a complex or bandwidth intensive technology for that. Primarily because people are don't have resources to afford those kind of high-tech solutions. Secondly, they don't have skills to use those kind of solutions. Moreover, infrastructure may not support that high-intensive bandwidth solutions. So in that sense, we suggest that you have to be social first, in the sense you identify social problem first, see if technology can be part of it, part of solution, and if technology is part of solution, how simplest technology I can use to address to the problem. Now, if you can use simple technology, in future you can always upgrade that if required to expand, and if resources allow, and if your respondent or your beneficiary are capable of using them, you can always upgrade them over time. But if you start with a high-tech solution, chances are that it may not be actually leveraged by people who cannot afford it. So that's one thing we realize in that stream of research. Second thing we identified is the culture has an important role to play in any of these solutions. Many times we think that technology is cultural neutral. And just in some extent, yes, it is. But again, the solution is embedded within the cultural context. Though technology might be cultural neutral, but the context is not. So for example, if you, we had a research project in Rajasthan, and they wanted to have a health record of child immunization and mother's medical records to be stored somewhere. And then they tried various ways of using system where they can input all the data and information. And they always found that either people were not using those solutions, they used to forget how to enter, where to keep. And eventually, after working with local people, they realized in those villages, most of the kids wear some kind of pendant with a black thread. So they thought, why not we create a pendant with NFC chip embedded into the pendant, so that anyway these kids wear those pendant in their kind of necklace thing. If we put our data storage on the pendant, it will be culturally appropriate in the context and people will use it. So once you make technology culturally appropriate, the usage of the technology is much more, the high adoption rate is more ensured compared to if you are not using culturally appropriate technology. So many times as a researcher, we think technology as a cultural neutral, but even in there, if we can make it culturally appropriate, the uptake and adoption of technology is much higher. So that's the second thing I think in digital social innovation is important to make sense. Once we are able to make it culturally appropriate, then we have to see how we can scale up, because there is a kind of trade-off. If you are trying to contextualize everything to every individual context, scaling up that becomes difficult. So then you have to resort to a trade-off between standardization and localization. And that trade-off is important to make as you plan to scale up. So you have to be careful how much localization you're doing and how you are then trying to standardize some part of it to scale it up. So that means backend can be fairly standardized, whereas front end has to be more localized in the context. So trade-off between localization and standardization is also important when you use digital social innovation. So I think with those 3 points, I'll stop here, and any question, happy to answer.
Thank you, Professor Qureshi, for that very insightful lecture. In fact, we recently, Professor Simi and I had an opportunity to do a research on access to digital markets. And this was particularly for women social entrepreneurs who belong to Kudumbashree. And we looked at their engagement across 3 different kinds of technology platforms. One was the Kudumbashree's own Kudumbashree Online Bazaar. Second one was a leading market online retail company. And the third was hyperlocal markets apps, which mostly used WhatsApp and other local apps for selling products. And as you rightly said, this technophysing was quite evident there, because the women were most comfortable using the hyperlocal apps, because that was something they could access and understand and had the ability to use. While their negotiation and selling products on an online space was very difficult, because many of them did not have that kind of technology access. They faced language barriers and did not know how to sell their products in a big marketplace, like how to replenish products or how to climb up the sellers list. Those were insurmountable difficulties for them. While when they used a hyperlocal app, they were a lot more comfortable selling their products, and hence it found favor with the grassroots level women. So some of the points which you said are really worth considering for us also to extend our study, and thank you so much for it. We now have our third speaker, Professor Ankur Salim, Professor from the Public Systems Group at IIM Ahmedabad. Professor, we're so keen to hear from you about the critical thinking in social innovation.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Supriya and Professor Joy. I mean, this is, at least for me, it's one of the first forums where we are having this conversation. So thank you for bringing us together. In a sense, I'm going to try to complement what Professor Qureshi and Professor Majumdar have said. And maybe I'm looking forward to also hear from Ms. Tanuja, because I think she brings in the practitioner perspective here. I'd like to sort of step back in a sense from what Israr was also talking about, but I think it just builds on it, which is basically maybe the kind of orientation that we as researchers, when we step into trying to research these ideas of social entrepreneurship and innovation, should we be carrying, and to engage with Professor Majumdar's sort of questions in terms of, is this a specific discipline? Is this a separate discipline? I think one is a question of disciplinary boundaries from the perspective of the phenomena itself, but the other could be in terms of the orientation that researchers come into studying questions within it. And I think the area of social entrepreneurship in some ways demands that we come into it with a different orientation, because if we are going to be talking about the social, we have to understand that the social is a contested affair, right? We too often give it a very easy pass when organizations or foundations or funders claim that there is social innovation or social entrepreneurship. We too often give it sort of yes, if of course if you're doing something and you're working with, say, the the economically bottom of the pyramid, then of course it is praiseworthy, and we should be studying just for, how do we further it, how do we scale it up, what is working there, what is not. We don't ask more critical questions about who exactly is gaining and who is not. And I think given how quickly the space is changing, and given the arenas in which social enterprises are trying to intervene in, whether it be education, health, you name it, there are competing interests here. And there are competing interests which are financial in nature. There are competing interests which are political in nature. And we have to start recognizing that and start asking, in some sense, what values do we espouse and what values do we want to see reflected in organizations. This is not a discipline, I strongly feel, that can be examined through simply a technocratic or a managerial lens. I think those elements are useful, but recognizing the values that underlie basic ideas around the enterprise that we might be studying are things that we need to be probing. And then, of course, the application of technocratic and managerial lenses helps us. But we have to start with this fundamental question of saying, if a social organization is working, whose problem is it really solving? And whose problem is it not solving, right? And I think it's in a sense even more important in this space, precisely because there are so limited resources that are coming in here. That we need to be extra careful about how these resources are being utilized and to whose end and to what purposes, right? And in a way, I'm also very wary of, we need to look back and the microfinance example, or the micro, so I'm going back now 2 decades at least, and the kind of valorization that accompanied that whole growth of the industry. And before we knew it, an industry which was being heralded as sort of, fighting poverty, introducing the idea of social entrepreneurship to us, was no longer even claiming that they were about poverty anymore, because they had just been taken up and morphed into sort of regular financial institutions. So, so my first point is that just because we think that they're working with, quote unquote, the poor, the marginalized or excluded, it doesn't necessarily, allow us to mean that they should be getting an easy pass on these. So now, and given that there are certain sort of suggestions I have in terms of saying, okay, what kind of studies perhaps we could be doing. One is it's important, even when we are studying enterprises, to do studies which follow the trajectory of an organization. There are multiple definitions of social enterprises, and one could get into and that's a never-ending debate in some sense. But the question for me never is this a social enterprise to start at the starting position, when it is at its origins, when we are looking simply at the design. The question is, do you remain a social enterprise as you scale up? And because how do you negotiate the tensions? How do you negotiate the pulls and pressures? And following trajectories of organizations, while case studies, etc., obviously become a very useful methodology. But if we want to engage with and understand the phenomena, then I think these longitudinal studies are become absolutely paramount and important to do. The other element that I would emphasize is, again, if we see these as organizations and enterprises which are trying to change society in some ways, we have to ask questions not only about the organizations themselves in terms of what are practices within them, but also and what is the impact per se that they might be creating on quote unquote beneficiaries. But we also should be asking, how are these organizations engaging with the larger social structures and political structures which are creating the problem in the first place? So are these organizations reinforcing structures, inequities, marginalizations, or are they challenging them? And, because there is no, I mean, so whilst, there is value in band-aids, and there is value in sort of stepping in and saying, hey, we are providing services right now that are not being provided in this community. The question is, are you going to then become in some ways, an alternate second-tier solution to people who were anyway underserved? Or are you taking us in a direction as a social enterprise are you taking us in a direction where one day this community, this group of people will not even need you, because they would be integrated into the larger mainstream and would get the same kind of services that the mainstream does? So I guess to sum up, what I'm trying to argue is, beyond looking at what is how fast the organization is growing, and those questions which are important in their own right, we have to ask questions of distribution. And just because we are quote unquote in a poor country, or we are working with poor communities, that doesn't mean that questions about distribution are not important. One of the phenomena that has accompanied, as we all know, the rapid rate of growth that we have experienced as a society is high increase in inequality. It is now no longer a disputable fact. So therefore, what is the role that these enterprises are doing vis-a-vis these structural factors that are leading us to become a much more unequal society, is also a question that I think should be on the table, along with the other questions that I am completely recognize and sort of see the value of. So that's probably the only interjection that I want to make in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sareem, for those insights. And recently we had an opportunity also to study impact investing, and we spoke to around 8 leading impact investors in India. And our motivation for that particular study was the increasing obfuscation we felt in the definition of an impact investor itself, because many of them self-label themselves as impact investors, while most of their impact investing patterns were more like commercial mainstream investors. And we do see that in terms of the choice of beneficiaries also, many of them had moved away from the BOP, who were the actual beneficiaries who needed their kind of investments, but had moved up to the middle class because they felt they were the ones who could pay for services and hence would make the enterprise more sustainable in the long run. So those were interesting contradictions we found, and many of the points which Professor Sareem that you mentioned, we could identify, and I think those would offer future directions for us to observe this phenomenon and study organizations better. And definitely, as you said, longitudinal studies are the need of the hour to see how social enterprises scale and if they continue to remain so as they scale. So thank you so much for that. We will come back to you with more questions. And finally, let me invite Tanuja from Wilgrow. Tanuja is going to be speaking on monitoring and evaluation and on social innovation practices, as well as the role of academic contributions. Tanuja, welcome to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Priya and Sami, especially for having me on here. I think firstly, it's really encouraging to see that there is growing work and interest in looking at what sort of research practitioners do need, right, in this space. So I essentially lead impact evaluation at Wilgrow, which is one of India's oldest for-profit social enterprise incubators. And of course, much of what the other panelists spoke about completely resonated, because one of the key things that we do look at and the challenges we face is defining it. What is impact? What does it mean to the different stakeholders involved? So I think, one of the key areas, and I mean, research is as well as something that Wilgrow has recently been exploring. And for us, research essentially means looking at, of course, aspects related to improving the way we understand how the end beneficiaries and customers are actually experiencing the product or the innovation in question, but also looking at what is the role that we as an incubator are playing, right, in a small and growing businesses role to become scalable and sustainable. So in light of that, in terms of, there are like 3 areas that which I think can greatly benefit from with more collaboration with academia and practitioners. So first, of course, is measuring and managing impact. This is recognized globally and especially in India as something that is critical. In India itself, social enterprises are defined in multiple models, right? Ranging from grassroots level to for-profit to even non-profit models. So I think what is really key is that it's so clear that this is an important element. And yet we have found that it is one of the least prioritized activities. And that's probably because often impact is something which is not immediately tangible, right? It impact can be short-term, medium-term, long-term. And hence, since it is not always immediately like a profit maximizing activity, it's something which is not prioritized. But of course, when we take, say, a beneficiary focused approach, right, to measuring impact, understanding the larger picture beyond just, okay, X number of people receive the service and so on, but how are they engaging with that product or service, right? How is it even improving the infrastructure, maybe, or the current systems? And again, this, I speak of infrastructure because Wilgrow, we typically support hardware-focused innovations, right? So these are, again, technologies which are enabling not only, last mile beneficiaries, but also the systems and healthcare setups and agriculture setups become more efficient and accessible. So I think, yeah, one of the key things is definitely, and what we are working on and which kind of sums up our approach to measurement is finding out the business value of impact, right? So of course, demanding data from our investees and companies, but also ensuring that they are getting actionable insights from that data, whether to improve operations, to improve product, to improve scale, strategy, and so on. Another area which I think is, really relevant and where we can really benefit from the ability of researchers to work with large data sets is benchmarking. So often, I think the challenge with this space, and now, you're also seeing, Professor Priya spoke of impact investing, you have, blended finance, innovative financial instruments, impact bonds coming up, right, where you pay for an outcome. And again, the challenge here is that, because typically social innovations are so different and unique in the way they are creating impact, how exactly can we compare them, right? We have the UN SDGs, there are metrics like IRIS, which we do follow, but I think a challenge is how can you say compare an agri-tech company working with farmers to a healthcare innovation company, enabling expectant mothers, right, to monitor their pregnancies. So these are again examples of companies we work with. So I think this is an area where there's plenty of data available, but again, as practitioners, we have limited capacity to, systematically kind of review this and be able to compare performance across different enterprises. And I think a third point, which I would also like to talk about, is essentially we also spoke about like the importance of culture, right, and defining what impact means and focusing on what the actual beneficiary needs are. So in a similar manner, also looking at the challenges that innovative social enterprises face in actually entering the market, because it's one thing to be able to develop a product or a technology or a service that is catering to the needs of the POP, but then also how do you enable that to be distributed and ultimately reach the last mile, right? And again, since as a business incubator, we support our enterprises across areas, ranging from financial compliance issues, because again, in India, that's, there's a lot of regulatory financial legal aspects which startups have to comply with, especially again, if they're tech-driven or hardware-driven. Also, of course, things like impact measurement in itself is an area where, there's a need for capacity building, product development, and so on. So I think even looking at sort of the challenges that innovative technologies especially face, and how are they overcoming that? Who are the players involved? How can government partnerships, for instance, be scaled up to actually enable that last mile reach? So yeah, these are kind of some of the areas which I think are quite relevant to the work that we're doing right now.
Thank you, Tanuja. This is really a very interesting area for us also to look at. And if I may ask you, what kind of work is Wilgrow doing in terms of developing social impact assessment models, and what kind of parameters do you differ across the industries that you are working with? Because you're working with a whole host of different industry social enterprises. So could you throw some light on that as well?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think at Wilgrow, we also struggled with, really finding a framework or something tangible that we could follow. So we ended up sort of borrowing from, the impact investing space, from the nonprofit space, and creating our own model and framework. If I had to put it very simply, I mean, the non-negotiable indicators that we do measure are the unique end beneficiaries or institutions reached by our enterprises, and the livelihoods generated, right? The direct livelihoods generated by these companies. So these are non-negotiable. Try to aggregate these as much as possible. But again, we have to keep in mind that each company is unique in the way it's, creating impact and reach. So the way we do this is, of course, by encouraging the companies to share monthly or quarterly data in the same way that they would financial data like revenue and sales, right? So impact is as important as any other operational or finance data. Another piece that we also work on is third-party assessments, right? Because again, a third-party impact study is equally important in terms of validation, in terms of understanding the depth of impact better, understanding longitudinal impact better. So these are kind of two areas in which we are constantly trying to build our own capacity and also help companies. We also very recently won our first ever research grant. So that's something quite exciting. So we have actually partnered with the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and are going to be conducting, I think, one of the first ever large scale studies to understand how impact measurement practices are benefiting early stage startups and social enterprises, and actually looking at how training and management practices can help these companies improve both financial and non-financial impact. So that's something.
Yeah, that's a very interesting line of work. I think we'll be very keen to understand what kind of results you come up with. Also, to ask you one of the points which Professor Sareen had raised. Have you been able to do a longitudinal study, because you are hand-holding enterprises for a fairly long period of time, and I would understand, continue to have access to them. So is that something that you're looking at?
Right. Yeah. So this is again something that we started doing very recently, where from this year onwards, on an annual basis, we are reaching out to our graduated alumni of companies and really understanding, right? Like things like range from basic things like, are they still active? Are they creating impact, to even understanding whether their impact model has changed? And essentially, what is their reach and focus currently. So yeah, this is something which I think had been long overdue, keeping track of longitudinal data. But yeah, this is something that we have begun from this year, and we will also be publishing the findings from this research probably sometime early next year. And yeah, definitely looking forward to inputs from academia and people working in the space as well, because I think this whole aspect of like longitudinal impact and really defining what is success, right? Like what is a successful social enterprise, I think is something which is like an open question.
Yeah. Thanks, Tanuja. Professor Sumit, would you want to chip in, and then we will, I would request you to open the floor to the entire audience, and we'll start taking audience questions now.
Yeah, so we can start off with a few of the questions that are coming to my mind.
Yes.
What-
Can I
Yeah.
have raised hands among participants? Then we would
So,
invite.
but let me just do a few. I mean, what I have done is I've got a few questions for each speaker. I just trigger the thought, and then we can go to the participant. So, beginning with Professor Satyajit, I think the interesting question he first raised is it is contextual, and so immediately at that moment the question came that some socially oriented organizations like Acumen and Ashoka, they have for quite some time now they have been working across geographies. So maybe if you have a view on that as to whether that is making the context more universal, that's one type of a question. And then of course one another question which comes to mind, and which I think I would put two questions together. One is that the role of technology, which Professor Satyajit raised, and so one way of looking at it seems to occur is that the space between social enterprise and entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship is blurring to the extent that technology is increasingly playing a role, because you have very similar app-based technology and others being used across both these areas. And if that is the case, then I think the fundamental issue that Professor Israr raised, that you should have appropriate technology. What do you do when the technology is being pushed by the startups? So the startups have a speed, they want to commercialize, they want to monetize the technology as quickly as possible. So there will be a lot of push from the startups who are developing technologies for the social sector. So I think these two questions, one context and the role of technology, if Professor Satyajit and Professor Qureshi can sort of just react to these. Professor Satyajit, you would like to go first because we can follow the same.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Professor Mitra, for picking up the right threads. I would say so. Why context-specific studies are needed? In fact, we have very interesting advantage, I would say, at TISS, because we do not belong to a management institution or B school frame, and we don't come from a very, very heavy academic view in terms of having an academic view and then offering a program. I think we didn't do both of the things, and I think that was the advantage. So I'll just answer your question why we believe that context plays a very critical role, and context need to be studied also in addition to sort of the models or the systems which you are referring to. Basically, we are a social science university. All of us know that, and social science university is very rightly placed in terms of having very field-based or field-intensive academic programs, and that's the beauty of social science discipline. And almost every program in TISS is research intensive and fieldwork intensive. So what we did is we fitted the three pieces together parallelly. A, the academic program in 1997. B, sorry, no, not 1997, a little later. B, the academic discipline in terms of research. We started recruiting PhD scholars and started also engaging in research. And the third is incubation center, which of course came a little later, but nevertheless, these three pieces came together. So what we saw that our the academic programs are also fed through the research and also practice, and vice versa. So we also have a social incubator, and we also kind of did a baby step in terms of establishing our incubation practices slightly differently. So that's the first reason we saw that every region in the country has got a different need for social enterprise. Okay, so not necessary that everywhere we need social enterprise in a very technical sense. Probably a small initiative in an entrepreneurial sense can do enough, right? So I think understanding the context, understanding the problem, and then thinking what social entrepreneurial process can be done. So we have tried to define very clearly what is social entrepreneurial approach, what is social enterprise. So not necessarily that everywhere we need social enterprise. So that's also we had that. And the third thing, which eventually we started engaging with countries across the globe, and we saw that the social enterprise are defined differently. the way it is understood and working in America is not the same way in Europe, is not the same way in Asian countries, is not the same way in Russia. Actually, we had an opportunity of working very closely with the Russian community and also South Asian community. So context plays very important role. I think the first thing is which variable of the context we'll have to bring to the table, and which piece is yet not solved, which problem is yet not solved where the social enterprises can come in. I think that's the fundamental thing which we talk about. So eventually we came to understand that there is some context which are deprived in the supply side, and there is some context which are deprived on the demand side. So not necessarily that every social enterprise have to work end to end, and that's our realization working in the field with partners, working with the social enterprises, working with the community, and also doing academics and the research. So we felt that the context probably helps us to articulate the business proposition, or maybe in a refined term business model. So I think that's the reason context have to be defined, and the social enterprise have to context appropriate. So that's the first thing. The second question which you asked is technology, which we also saw that which Israr was also saying, that not every time we need a cutting edge technology, we need good enough technology probably. And the answer resides in how we say mobile penetration has gone so well in the rural India. And not that rural India is less intelligent, less articulate than urban India. That's not true. But how mobile and internet technology has really penetrated on its own and created a different, how UPI system is working so well. And currently we are working very closely with group of enterprise in Bastar district in Chhattisgarh, in Jhabua in Western Badar, typical tribal dominant areas. We know Bastar has an issue of Naxalism also. So, and we are surprised that UPI system of payment is almost given. It's almost given, but not so in Jammu and Kashmir. When we engage with the social entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs in Jammu and Kashmir, it's not so common. So that's precisely again the contextual and technology and context sort of these dual views can be thought through. So I think how we look at the technology is also a question by social enterprises, and I'm in full agreement that cutting edge technology not necessarily always needed. Probably we need technology which is good enough, maybe appropriate to create a desired social value.
Yeah, Professor Israr, would you also like to give some views on this technology part? Because the feeling is that now we are seeing a lot of startups even seeing interest in technology startups in the social sector. And how would that impact?
Sorry, I was mute. I would put this in two ways. One, more academic lens, and then second way, more practitioner-based approach. So if you see any transaction involved requires certain costs, so search, negotiation, monitoring, enforcement. And digital technology is very good at first two costs. So it reduces search cost. It helps reduce negotiation cost because you can simultaneously see multiple options. So in that sense, wherever your transactions for marginalized community is about search and negotiation cost, you can implement a technology to reduce those costs and help the beneficiaries. So to that extent, digital technology can be helpful and useful. It doesn't do as well in terms of monitoring and enforcement, because then local institutions, informal and formal institutions play an important role, and which is very difficult for technology to bypass actually. You can try and you can do some experimentation, but it doesn't succeed most of the time in reducing enforcement and monitoring costs. So that means as long as there's a role of reducing search and negotiation costs, technology will actually play a role, and no matter who is implementing, depending on how you focus on making it more democratic in terms of accessibility and other things, it can be successful. If you don't take care of democratizing technology, it can increase existing inequalities. So in that sense, what earlier Ankur was referring, it depends how you implement it. The second aspect, more practitioner aspect here, and I'm not very sure I saw this in India a lot, but any if you're taking any grand challenge or any SDGs, it's hard to imagine one organization can solve those problems because the problems are human-based. And I haven't seen a system-level approach being implemented in Indian context. I'm not very aware. But I can give an example here in Australia. We had a very bad summer of Australia in 2019-20 with huge wildfires and affected lots of communities. Immediately after that, we also faced increase in COVID incidences immediately after February and March 2020. So there were many communities who were cut down from regular supplies of food and necessities. And in Victoria, which is a province where Melbourne is a capital of the province, the Victorian social enterprises realized that one single social enterprise won't be able to tackle even fraction of this problem. So they mobilized entire sector in an ecosystem approach way, where those who were growing the food product, those who were in transportation activities, those who were in activity of hospitality, like packaging and cooking those stuff, and then for delivery. So entire sector moved together. And they were able to feed many immigrants, refugees, marginalized communities for a number of months. Now, on the front end, there was not much use of technology because you have to deliver food physically. So obviously, there's a physical component to it. But what role technology played in the background was communication coordination, estimating locations, identifying best route to reach to places, smoothing all the logistic issues in the supply chain. So I think technology has a big role to play, but not always in the front end. On the front end, as long as it can reduce negotiation and search costs, that role can be played. But in back end, coordination, communication, logistic organization, finding shortest path to certain places, all those things can be tackled using innovative implementation of technology.
Thank you. Thank you. There is another aspect, I think, for Professor Ankur, I had this, this was coming to my mind, that we are—
It's 5 o'clock.
Sorry. We were very much aware of I completely agree with the fact that we have to have more of social impact. But if we look at the COVID-19 scenario, then we find that a lot of commercial organizations, given whatever their scale, their money power, their technology power, have come forward and mitigated lot of the COVID-related problems. In the sense, making masks and auto companies making ventilators and things like that, both here and rest of the world. So there is a situation where a commercial company would get into the social service space. And how do you think that will pan out in the future? Would they have the type of social, embeddedness, or they would have that type of social feel for the people, BOP and other people they are serving, or would they slowly and steadily commercialize whatever they have been able to do in COVID time?
It's a big question, and I don't have a complete answer to this, but I think, fundamentally, the involvement of large enterprises or commercial enterprises trying to do and, help socially in some sense, how that plays out depends on the orientation and the attitude of the organization. And I've been involved, trying to get basic material to frontline workers, over 50,000 frontline workers distributed all over India. If an organization comes in with sort of this, charity mode, saying, hey, we are doing you a big favor, it's actually creating more problems for you than it is actually doing good. That's what my experience has been. And and I would, rather not have that kind of charity mode in these spaces. Now, whether or not, I think the question you're asking is that what happens if organizations start seeing a scope for commercial growth, and then do they integrate? I think that's the DNA of a commercial organization, that where it finds opportunities for growth, and to sort of work and meet their margins, they would. And there's nothing particularly wrong there either, because after all, there is provision of basic services, and at the end of the day, most of our services that even we consume are provided by large-scale organizations. It's not like we are consuming products that are made out of social enterprises per se. So there isn't, I don't see necessarily a problematic, an immediate problem there. The question again is the twofold. One is information transparency. Do people who are, quote unquote, supporting an entity or consuming the products and services, are they fully informed? What are the likely long-term implications, right? We're talking about technology. I am very, very right now about what's going on in the ed tech space in India, and the growth of, and the so-called unicorns that you hear about every day on a daily basis. And here we have, at the same time, the simultaneously backing of these entities by organizations that declare themselves to be impact investors. And on the other hand, in some, either the promotional strategies that are being used, or what is happening vis-a-vis, promises being made to governments, and how those relationships are panning out. And is this fundamentally good for our children? I mean, unless we are pausing and asking these questions, and instead we are, so focused on how fast the entity is growing and what are the valuations, I am deeply skeptical of, where this all is heading to. So I'm not sure I'm completely answering, but I hope I am.
Anybody would like else, the panel would like to, add anything here? Or because I think Professor Sarin has raised this important issue. And why I was asking this is, we have the example of Grameen Danone type of thing, where Grameen itself played a role to ensure that the Danone shareholders don't ask for a higher return from the yogurt that they're selling in Bangladesh. And Danone ensured that many of their shareholders that look at the investment you make here as more of a, low return, long-term investment. And for the rest of the investment you have made in Danone, we will make you the usual commercial return. So is there a role for either the state or the social enterprise partner to sort of channelize the energy of a commercial enterprise in the right direction? Just as a continuation of that, Professor Sarin or anybody?
Yes, Professor Satyajit.
Yes, Professor Satyajit.
Yeah, I'm in agreement what Ankur is raising the question about. I think we need to be clear that everybody who is working on healthcare, everybody who is working on education need not necessarily be a social enterprise. And if somebody is not a social enterprise, no issues about it. I think that's fundamentally is important for all of us to sort of appreciate, if not anything else, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is, yes, so I think where is the testing line? And it's a gray area, right? But there's no dividing line between social enterprise and commercial enterprise. Okay, I look at it more from continuum. But what is the testing question, which will define necessarily a social enterprise is the decision making approach where you make trade-off with. Okay, what is that you make trade-off with? Okay, do you believe that you can sacrifice economic return? I'll not call profit, economic return because you are more concerned about the social return, and vice versa. I think that's the testing time we can question. And there are organizations who are able to balance both of them. Probably, and that's the gray area I'm referring to. But it's very important for us to understand that whenever, I'm sorry, probably I'm making a controversial statement here. Let us be very clear that whenever we see investors coming in, and nothing wrong, investors coming in, but what I'm saying, we need to ensure that investors are here not as a donor. Investors are here as an investor, right? And investors would expect certain amount of economic return. And that's the time probably we'll have to sort of question how much of the social return or how much of a social change, if I put it in the extreme end, is going to be facilitated by investors' involvement in the enterprise. I think these are the larger questions we'll have to ask ourselves. Again, I also believe that there's nothing wrong if somebody is purely commercial enterprise, because I'm in full agreement. There are a lot of products and services which we consume are not manufactured by social enterprise. Rather, social enterprise contributing to the larger market has got a limited scope, because social enterprise cannot work on maximization principles. They work on optimization principle most of the time. So obviously the reach will be constrained, efficiency will be constrained, the market expansion will be constrained. So we should not expect that social enterprise will do everything. Now the question of state, which is actually very, very critical. Though state may not intervene directly, but nevertheless, certain fundamental services like education and primary healthcare, certainly state has a role to play. So we cannot deny that state can simply sort of stay away from from looking at it from the outsider sort of fence. State has a role to play, and I think state has to take a call on that.
So that brings us, when we are talking of the commercial and social, I think that brings me to Tanuja, because the whole idea of having a commercial benefit, yes, or economic returns is yes, but we should also understand the social impact that they have made. Now, the point you were making is one point that struck me is, which is a fact as of date, is that impact is not taken seriously whenever it comes to the working of a social enterprise. Now, would you agree to this point that impact is not taken seriously when a social enterprise works? It is possibly because they still have a mindset of philanthropy. Sort of, we got this, we did this, and we forget it because this is the best we could do. One, and the second, on the other side, lack of accountability. That, the money comes, or more, even if you're a social enterprise, sometimes the mindset is more of an NGO. If grant has come, we have exhausted the grant, we have done something, and that would be the reason why impact is not becoming serious as a area of study. What would your reactions be?
Yeah, I think both the points that you raised are very valid, and we have seen enterprises going down both routes, right? And again, this is probably the main reason, because funding and sustainability is such a challenge for such enterprises. And at present as well, in India, social enterprise is largely funded from a philanthropic lens, right? So for instance, even, one of the things that Will Grow is also working on is trying to engage more CSR funding and funders and Indian foundations and philanthropists with the concept of supporting for-profit social enterprises. And again, I think, one of the main challenges is this like non-tangibility, right, of impact, and sort of difficulty in being able to measure that and share those results very immediately, and perhaps impatience, on the end of investors or funders as well to see that sort of data. But yeah, I do agree with the point, mentioned by Professor Satyajit as well, that yeah, this burden and onus should not be on the social enterprise entirely. And it is sort of a responsibility of all the stakeholders. So whether it's intermediaries like us, incubators, accelerators, investors, and also funders, whether commercial or impact, to demand impact data, to demand how the beneficiary is being impacted, to ensure no negative impact is being created. But I think also to provide equal support to enable the company to, measure that, right? So that is, I think, where, and I'll just add, so Professor Simi, her mic is not working, but she had a question that how do incubators ensure social enterprises stay on course, right, and defend against demanding investors? This is, of course, a challenge, because on one hand, we are trying to get these investors to be interested in our companies, like not only impact investors, also commercial investors, but of course, also we ourselves have invested in this company because they said they have a commitment, right, a social commitment to creating impact. So yeah, one, of course, is sort of contractual commitments, and if it's an enterprise, for instance, where it could either inherently be impacting BOP beneficiaries, right? Or maybe they've created sort of a universally applicable technology or solution. In that case, we will say create a mandate that, okay, then at least 30% of your customers need to be at the base of the economic pyramid, right? So there are, I mean, different strategies that we will use basis the type of enterprise, type of innovation, who their sort of key consumer is. And yeah, I think the second piece is, which I did mention, is the capacity building, right? And creating that mindset of impact being as important a business metric as sales and revenue and fundraising is. So because ultimately that is, we are also kind of temporarily engaging with the company, right? Though, of course, when we do select companies, we are looking at product market fit, ability to create impact. But at the end of the day, mission drift, right? Or whether they will continue creating this impact may not always be in our control, right? 5 years, 10 years down the line. So I think this piece of like integrating impact into business operations is something really critical to ensure. And that also, I think, is something which empowers the company then if, say, they're negotiating, right, with an investor, that say, this is, an important piece of business, I need to measure such information. So I would like you to, say, fund a third-party study, right, for me to be able to do this. So, yeah.
So we'll take a response from Professor Israr Qureshi. I think his hand is raised, and then we will open it to the floor to the other participants. Yes, please, Israr.
So I will combine both the previous question and this question together in the answer. We have to understand, if you talk about those who are serving top of the pyramid, luxury class and all, or even middle of the pyramid, more or less across doesn't matter whether you're in US or India, they likely have more similar consumption patterns. So the idea of scaling, which we use for a commercial organization which is involved in luxury product, is very different than idea of scalability, where the consumers, quote unquote, or beneficiaries are very different even within the country. Within India itself, you're looking for people who are in marginalized section. Their requirements and what they like and not like is very different. So I think instead of thinking of scaling up an organization, we should be more thinking in terms of scaling up an idea. So the idea is wonderful. Let us make it publicly available. People who are in different contexts can then contextualize that idea in their own context and provide solution. So to that extent, I think Willgrow and similar ecosystem incubators, they have much important role to play in cross-seeding these ideas, making those as widely available as possible for local social entrepreneur to customize those ideas into their own social impact creation. So I think while idea can grow, we don't necessarily need to grow an organization, because if you are working, for example, successfully in Karnataka, in remote part of Karnataka, there is no guarantee that you can use same model and put in remote part of West Bengal. Why not make those ingredients available to somebody who in West Bengal can learn from it and then implement in their own context. So idea grows, solution grows, but not necessarily organization itself need to scale up. So I think given the context we are in, where social entrepreneurs are engaged in, we need local solution. Although some of local entrepreneurs may not be having those ideas available, if we can make those solutions available broadly and widely, we can create more larger impact. Grameen Bank is not successful because it's the biggest microfinance organization. It is not. The success of Grameen Bank is because they made idea available to anybody to copy. Of course, then there was a scarce type of people who copied it wrongly, but then there were many other organizations which implemented their model quite successfully, and impact grew across the globe.
So thank you, panelists. I think there will be some floor questions. I'll ask Madam Aarti and then Madam Ankita to please unmute and ask their questions. Yes. Madam Aarti, maybe start with.
Yeah. So the first question, my first question was to Ms. Tanuja. Since she is in the practice-oriented field, actually I had a proposal which I had prepared for impact investors, and I was looking at the behavioral aspects of the impact investors. So I wrote to her direct chat that do you have a data to support this, or would you be able to help me on this? And are you collecting or working on something like this?
Right. So yeah, thanks, for your question on this. So on your first question on, do we have data on this? So not explicitly. I mean, we've not really studied the decision making of investors. But in saying that, of course, since we do make equity investments in our companies, we have an internal investment committee which routinely evaluates enterprises. And of course, we have a large network of other such impact investors, right, in this space in India. So always happy to, connect you.
Surely I'll do that.
Yeah. And regarding a question on, are we working on something like this? So we are actually right now in the initial stage of designing a study to look at this in the context of healthcare innovations, right? Because so healthcare is one large area for Wilgrow. Like I mentioned, we are supporting hardware-based innovations, and healthcare enterprises often have the longest gestation period to actually enter the market because of, again, product regulatory issues, and so on, and just sensitivity of healthcare data. So yeah, in this space, we are trying to understand, and again, because of this sort of longer gestation period for impact, they do face difficulty with raising, commercial investment, even impact investment. So yeah, this is a space which we are trying to understand better. So happy to chat more.
Thank you. Yeah, and my second question is for Professor Qureshi and Professor Sareen. So we discussed on the social innovation aspect, how the studies would go. So my PhD is related to digital, so technological enablement of social innovation, and I am focusing on the rural healthcare. So in that case, you mentioned that either it can be a case study approach or it can be a longitudinal approach, basically. So is it possible that I can take both the approaches and do one study as a case study and do another one as longitudinal?
So, so case study can be longitudinal. You can have long engagement in the field for years on a single case. So that will be single longitudinal case. So they are not either or, you can combine them together. Is that a question?
No, case studies, I was saying the more than one organization, because since I'm doing in social innovation in healthcare, not each social innovation is a different kind, basically. So someone is going for, say, teleconsultation, someone is going for the creating digital equipment which will help in the healthcare. So the innovations are differing. So those case studies would be sort of caselets kind of thing. But if I'm looking at longitudinal, I would look at say probably one or two organizations over the period of say next 2 to 3 years.
Yes, I think that's feasible, depending on, of course, how much time horizon you have for your thesis work, because I think there's always a risk in doing thesis for longitudinal study because there's a time bound to time. So there's a practical aspect of it, but theoretically it's possible to case study in a longitudinal fashion.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Qureshi, I think Ankita Tandon has a question for you.
Yes.
She asks if how do you see the role of AI playing out in the social enterprise sector?
I think if you look for IFAD, IFAD, their work in the agriculture sector, they use AI quite intensively to understand the issues with the farming, the moisture contents and other aspect of soil, to continuously monitor in a way where then intelligent solution can be provided to farmer what to use and what not to use. Now, I think the cost implementation at this point is slightly prohibitive in remote context of India, but the cost of implementation of AI is coming down fairly fast. So in that sense, there is an opportunity to use AI in variety of social sector. Depends on where your focus is. Again, as I said before, we shouldn't look for technology first and then try to find where it can be used. Rather, our approach should be, what is the problem at hand? And then if that problem can be solved without technology, well and good, we don't need technology. If technology can play a role, again, going for a technology which is just enough to solve the purpose is good. If you think AI would be really a good solution for this particular problem, of course we can use AI, provided cost is not prohibitive for the beneficiaries.
Thank you, Professor Qureshi. Mr. Rajiv Ranjan, you can ask your question, and I think this will be the last question.
So, very quick comment and then a question, if I'm allowed.
Yes.
So the quick comment would be that we can look at the care economy model, which can be broadening of the public, private and civil society mechanism for public action, probably. So that is what we keep discussing, and we cannot move beyond that. So something the public sociality in that context, and Ellen Fiske also talks about, there is a paper by Fiske on various ways of public sociality. So I know everyone is a great scholar here, so everyone would know that, but probably we can have a relook at those things to get into that. And to continue with Professor Sareen's point on how we look at all the things which are happening in the social entrepreneurship domain, and this whole idea of impact investing, and whether it is contributing to social change or positive social change and all this thing, this becomes very important. There is a very interesting paper by Hari Bapuji et al. In 2018, which talks about businesses and society, businesses contributing to social inequality creation, and which is very paradoxical in nature. In that context, and looking at the interest rates and all that, and how those are there, and then impact investing, it seems to me very again paradoxical how impact investing is there. So we need to, I would like any of the panelists to maybe make me understand whether impact investing is going the right way. Probably, I think it is not.
Professor Sareen, would you like to start by reacting?
I think it's important to, it's important to be careful not putting everything into one giant umbrella. I mean, impact investing, unfortunately, is a term like social entrepreneurship, which has come to take on multiple meanings, and there are multiple different actors in it with very different philosophies and attitudes and ways of operation. So it wouldn't be right to dismiss off an entire, endeavor or initiative in this. And I think that's where we need more nuanced sort of research to be saying what models of impact investing work and what are not working vis-a-vis the social perspective. I mean, although I've spent a good part of my career doing impact evaluations, I have come to sort of, in this space, I've come to very strongly believe more than outcomes, we need to also, be paying a whole lot more attention to internal governance processes and practices of organizations, because outcomes in this space are more fungible. We already know they're very difficult to measure, but they are also more fungible. And claims can be very difficult to examine and justify. So, I mean, but again, to your question, I think we need to be careful not just throughout the entire, the industry as such in one sweep. Yeah.
So thank you, Professor Sareen, for answering this. I always sound very arrogant, but you know me, I am like that. I have been your student, so thank you for being humbly answering my question. I am not that
nice to see you.
Sorry for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Raji, for your question. So we come to an end of this panel discussion. It's an honor for me to thank our eminent panelists who joined us today evening. Professor Satyajit Majumdar, Professor Ankur Sareen, Professor Isar Qureshi, thank you so much for coming in. And Tanuja, thank you so much for that industry perspective and all the several points you shared about what Wilgrow's plans are in this space. I have to thank the participants as well for their engaging questions and for keeping the discussion going. I hope we are going to continue this conversation, and we can continue this conversation from CESI, and we will definitely be getting back to you. Professor Sumit, would you like to say a few lines and then conclude?
Yeah, I mean, we have had a very interesting session, and I think we have had very interesting perspectives. So we have Professor Ankur coming from, I think, more social science side. I've been debating this with a lot of social science people, even back home. So in my home itself. So I know that perspective they take. Professor Qureshi, we have been fortunate to interact earlier as well. And he's very great interest in the subject of technology. And he really goes into very interior parts of India and has a real good feel of the BOP participants in this entire social innovation, social entrepreneurship space. I have seen the very active working of Professor Satyajit, and it is very vibrant place. And I think the idea that he brought in, that we have students working in the field, we have teaching, shaping them through our teaching, and then the incubation is absolutely a wonderful balance that this maintains. And I think for particularly to create the ecosystem of producing good social enterprises. And of course, Tanuja's organization, Wilgrow, has been doing great work. I have been interacting with a lot of people there, with your CEO and the previous people. And I think Wilgrow has been one of the very successful organization in bringing hard technology in the social enterprise sector, and not one of them only restricted to making apps or AI for the social sector. So that's a difficult job, a challenge that they have taken. So thanks to all the panel members for finding time and taking out time to share your views. And thanks to the audience for asking good questions and participating in the discussion. And thanks to my colleagues, they have taken all the trouble to organize, Professor Simi and Professor Pia. And I hope that we will be getting your inputs and attention to our activities in CESI, our Center for Entrepreneurs Social Innovation. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much.